So, hi everyone, my name is John. I organize this group, Sitheads Meditation Club. Sitheads is a sitting and social group for people interested in deep meditation practice. And if you want to hang out with us, you can find us at sitheads.com. That's sit-heads.com. Now, at Sitheads, we don't have a set teacher. We're a peer group, but we do have visiting teachers come join us from time to time and other guests. It is my absolute pleasure to welcome and to introduce to you Dr. Sara Lazar. Dr. Lazar is a professor at Harvard Medical School and a researcher at Massachusetts General Hospital. And she is one of the world's foremost experts on the neuroscience of meditation and yoga. So she did and continues to do some pioneering brain scanning research. And through that research, she has demonstrated that meditation can physically change the brain, the prefrontal cortex, the amygdala, and other brain regions. Now, Dr. Lazar is, not surprisingly for someone in that line of work, a meditator and a yogi with her own personal practice that goes back, I think, quite a while, over 20 years. Right, so that's Dr. Sara Lazar. Really thrilled to have her with us. What we're going to do is Dr. Lazar is going to give us a short presentation on the subject of equanimity, which I'm particularly excited about, having read some of her writing on that topic. And then so we're going to do that till the hour mark. And if there's time left over before the hour mark, I might ask Dr. Lazar a couple follow-up questions and have a little conversation with her. And then at the hour mark, we're going to switch to Q&A. And I think we'll hopefully get to have a full hour of Q&A if Dr. Lazar is game and able to stay with us for that long. All right. So when we get to the Q&A part, I'll talk about how to ask questions, like our sort of format for asking questions. All right. So with all that said, Dr. Lazar, if there's anything you'd like to say before sort of getting started, please absolutely feel free. And then I'm looking forward very much to your presentation, and I'm sure everyone else is too. Thanks for being with us.
Yeah, well, thank you for having me all. And this is very informal. So, we're going to have a long time to talk, which is great. But if during my presentation I say something that's not clear, or you just want to clarify something like technical, feel free to jump in and ask a clarifying question, and then but obviously we'll have lots of time afterwards to also talk. So, but definitely, if I say something to understand, just jump in and ask a question. You don't need to raise your hand, just to unmute yourself. All right, so let's see if I can share my screen. All right, you guys can see this. All right. All right, so you probably all heard this definition from Jon Kabat-Zinn, which is mindfulness is purposely paying attention to experience in the present moment in a non-judgmental way. And a lot of people get hung up on this last part of the definition, the non-judgmental way. And I personally prefer to say, attention to experience in the present moment with equanimity. So what exactly is equanimity? To my way of thinking, equanimity is the fruit of enlightenment. Right. And so, yes, you understand the ultimate nature of reality, and that you understand, the non-duality and all those sorts of things. But then the benefit of that is that it leads to this long lasting, pervasive equanimity. So what exactly is equanimity? And so it's not so much that enlightenment leads to it does lead to pervasive joy, right? At least that's what they tell us. But this idea that, this non-reactive way of experiencing life, and that so the roots of equanimity are equi, so equal, and so the idea is that we have a balanced reaction to whatever we encounter, and it's different from indifference in terms of the quality of the heart. So with indifference, we may be non-reactive to our experience, but we're doing it in this close-hearted, uncaring way. Whereas equanimity, we're not reacting, but yet our heart is open, and we care. So we hear about it, we care what's happening, we respond, but we're not thrown off balance by it. So is there any evidence for this? And so that's what I'm going to show you tonight is 2 different experiments we've done, which are, which gives some hints at equanimity and how it's working in the brain. So the first study was done by Tim Gard. He's a grad student in the lab. And so both of them we're going to be talking about pain and fear. So let's just talk about pain for a moment. How does pain work? There's 2 components to pain. One component of pain is the actual physical sensations. So the buzzing, throbbing, stabbing, burning sensation, and then the emotional reaction to it. I don't like it. Make it stop. Why me? I don't want this anymore. And what's really clearly known is that those are in 2 different parts of the brain, and those 2 things are independent from each other. So this is imagine you're looking at this way. So this is the front of the head. So the eyeballs right about here, actually about here. And then, this is your brain. And then, let me do this real quick. This is the back of the brain. So the sensation comes in from the periphery. So from your hand or your foot, and it goes up the spinal cord into the brainstem. And then this blue network, this is the sensory network. This is the burning, stabbing, throbbing sensation of it. And then the brown network is the, I don't like it, make it stop. And what's really cool is when you look at pain, there's a lot of different ways to control pain. So just experimentally, what we know is that, for instance, if you're not paying attention to the pain, if you're distracted, you don't feel the pain so much, right? You may not even notice pain at all. And the classic example of that is the warrior in battle, that they're so caught up on the, fighting that they don't even notice that they've been mortally wounded until after the battle is done. You can also play with expectations. So I can say, oh, I can give you this shot and it's not going to hurt a bit, right? And if you believe me, you will report there's less pain. You can also play with placebo. So I could give you a cream and say, there's something in this cream, and I put it on your hand, and the cream is going to block the pain. And again, if you believe me, you will not feel the pain. And what's interesting is go back. Oh, come on. All 3 of these look more or less the same in the brain. All 3 of what these happens is that the front of the brain, which is a controlling part of the brain, and the I don't like it, make it stop part of the brain, literally turns off the blue network. So you literally don't feel the pain. It just doesn't come up. So the sensory signal comes in, it goes up the spinal cord into the thalamus, and then it just stops, and so you just don't even see it, here in the rest of the brain. So you're just not feeling it. So the question is, what about mindfulness? Does mindfulness work the same, or does it work different? So what we did is we put people in the MRI scanner, and we applied a very mild electric shock to the back of their hand. And so it was, they were told either that they were going to, just to lie there, and then during 40-second period, they were randomly zapped 3 times at just random times during this 40-second period. And then we asked to rate them, both the intensity of the burning, stabbing sensations, and also the unpleasantness of it. And so what do we see? So the blue, so here's the front of the brain. And what we see is in the front of the brain that this is the mindfulness practitioners and this is controls. And I should say we did it first in a normal state, and then we told them to be mindful. And for the controls, we explained what mindfulness was right before they went in the scanner and told them, okay, we'll just pay attention to it, and try to do it in this non-judgmental way. And so we see for the controls is that the front of the brain, that relative to the normal baseline, the front of the brain turns on. But for the mindfulness practitioners, the front of the brain, the I don't like it, make it stop, turns off. So blue is the normal state and the green is a mindful state. And then here in sensory cortex, the blue network, what we see is that for the mindfulness practitioners, there's actually more activity. And in the controls, there's less activities. So let's pause for this and think about this for a second, right? So this is the exact opposite of what we're seeing with placebo and attention and distraction and expectation, right? So the controls that look the same as that, right? So the controls, they're turning on the front of the brain and turning off the sensory cortex. But the mindfulness practitioners are turning off the front of the brain, the I don't like it, make it stop, and turning on the actual sensory experience. So at first this was a little bit of a head scratcher, but then we realized, this is the definition of mindfulness. They're paying attention to the present moment sensory experience in this non-judging, equanimous way, right? So they're not trying to defend against it. They're not, trying to control it. They're just allowing it to happen. We also, as I said, asked them to rate the intensity and the unpleasantness. And for the controls, we see that there's basically no change in the intensity. If anything, it went up a little bit. For the mindfulness practitioners, on a scale of 1 to 10, how intense is it? It went down a little bit, but not significantly. But in terms of the unpleasantness, the I don't like it, make it stop, there was a very significant drop for the mindfulness practitioners. So this is really interesting. So although they were paying more attention to it and feeling it more strongly, they're saying it just didn't bother them so much, which is really, really interesting, right? And so this is equanimity, right? This is they're open to it, they're allowing it to happen, they're experiencing it in this caring way, and yet they're saying it's not unpleasant, right? And this was a very similar study done by another group. They did some additional analyses, and what they showed was that, going back here, that because I told you the front of the brain literally turns off this part of the brain. And what they showed is that the ratings of pain was related to how much the front of the brain and the back of the brain talk to each other. And what they also showed was that so this went down. So the less the two regions were talking to each other, the less pain there was. And this was related to years of meditation. So the more meditation experience you had, the more the front of your brain was turned off, and the more the back of the brain, the sensory part of the brain, was turned on. Right. So it shows that yes, meditation really does work. And yes, it is cumulative. So even those times when you're sitting and it feels like nothing is happening, things are indeed happening. And so let's go ahead.
Sorry, could I ask a clarifying question?
Yep.
About the experience?
Yep.
Experiment. So for the before and after, the two bars, first was you didn't tell them to do anything in particular. And the second was you said, okay, now this time around, we want you to be
mindful.
More intentionally mindful, kind of?
Exactly, yeah.
Okay. Yeah. Okay. Thanks.
Right. And so, I mean, this is true. It's sort of like, okay, so, what are you doing if you're not being mindful the first time around? And so it's hard to know, but, and there's a couple of people who have replicated this, and they haven't told people explicitly to be mindful or not be mindful. And they just compared meditators' controls, and they basically found the same thing. Yeah.
Okay, thanks.
Good question. Yeah. Any other questions while we're here? No? Cool. Okay. So, right. So we had this quote from Alan Watts. We got a couple quotes tonight. So in a certain sense, Zen is feeling life instead of feeling something about life, right? And so that's exactly what we just saw, that they were actually feeling it instead of the, I don't like it, make it stop. It's the actual, they're just feeling the sensations. We also have this quote from Sylvia Boorstein. Life is painful, suffering is optional, right? Because we can't avoid pain, when painful things happen, we can choose to bitch about it and, go, oh, woe is me, and I wish this would change. Or you can say, okay, it's painful, but I'm not going to suffer about it. So that was the first study. So now we did another one that was similar, but a little bit different. And it was about fear and fear conditioning. I'm just going to skip through this real quick. All right, so can meditation help with fear and anxiety? And so what we did is we did a 2-day fear conditioning protocol, and I'm going to show you this in a second. And then we randomized people to either mindfulness-based stress reduction, so 8 weeks of mindfulness training, or to exercise. And exercise is a really good way to reduce stress, right? It's probably one of the most effective ways known to reduce stress. And then we repeated this fear conditioning protocol at the end of the 8 weeks. All the subjects were told that there was no control group, right? That both interventions were going to be beneficial. And the exercise group, in addition to exercising every day, so the mindfulness group, they get class once a week where they actually practice for 40 minutes in class, and then they're told to practice every day at home for 40 minutes. So the exercise group, they practiced exercise, calisthenics and stuff like that in class for 40 minutes, and they were told to practice at home for 40 minutes as well. And then they also got information about diet, sleep, and positive attitude and humor. They're both told to practice 40 minutes per day at home. And also both had a half-day retreat in the 6th week. And so for the exercise group, they actually exercised, I think, twice. But then we gave them some really good organic vegetarian food, and they got on chair massage, and they learned some other, learned about some humor and stuff like that. So it was very balanced as much as we could in terms of, the two conditions, because there's been a lot of complaints about meditation research that, oftentimes it's just compared to people doing nothing. And so, we really wanted to, up the ante, so to speak. All right, so what did they do? So the same thing as before, we put them in the scanner, we gave them this mild electric shock, but this time, in addition to getting shocked, they also saw different colored lights. And so fear conditioning is a lot like Pavlovian conditioning, sort of good old Pavlov, where, the dogs, you hear the bell and they got fed the same time they heard the bell. And so they learned to salivate when they heard the bell. So the same thing here, what happens is that initially they get shocked and they see these different colored lights. And they then learn that that light means they're going to get shocked. And so they have a fear response to the lights, even when they're not getting shocked. And the way it works is a little bit complicated. You see 3 different colored lights. And so to the yellow light, they never get shocked, but they do get shocked to the red light and the blue light. And this is, so this is where they learn that they're getting shocked, that certain lights mean they're going to get shocked. Then what we do is we just show them the yellow and the blue light, but we don't shock them. And so then they learn that the blue light means blue light is safe, but they have no new information about the red light. Then we bring them back the next day and we show them all the lights again, but we don't shock them again, right? And so they just, and so the question is, okay, well, how are they responding to the red light relative to the blue and the yellow light? And also, how are they even responding to the blue light? Do they remember that the blue light means that they're no longer being shocked? Or do they respond to the blue light the same way they respond to the red light? And so I'm not going to show you all of this, but I'm going to show you most of it today. So importantly, both groups reduce stress, right? Because again, we want to show that we want a really active control group. So the exercise group reduced stress, but the meditation group also improved emotion regulation, and also, this is difficulty with emotion regulation, so down is good. And they also reduced anxiety, more so than the exercise control group. So it really does show that mindfulness, is doing something that not all forms of stress reduction are the same, right? So that they both reduce stress, but there's extra benefits to mindfulness. We also found that the amount of home practice correlated with the changes with stress, and also with the emotion regulation test. So again, all the practice that you're doing really does add up. So now what about the fear conditioning? So this is a little bit of a head scratcher initially, so just bear with me. So what we see, this is all on day 1 while they're still getting shocked. What we see is that at baseline, both the controls and the meditators have a nice big fear response. So this is, we measure their skin conductance, right? So how much they're sweating in response to getting shocked. And so this is the response to the red and blue light, and then the blue, sorry about the colors, the blue is how much they're responding to the yellow light, right? And so you can see that, they're having a much bigger response to the lights where they're getting shocked compared to the lights where they're not getting shocked, which is what you expect. At post, what we saw is that basically there's no change in the meditators, but in the controls, there's this big drop. And we said, what's up with this? We actually sort of hypothesized that it was going to be the other way around. But then we stopped and thought about it, and we realized, no, this is exactly what we should expect, because what's happening here is that the controls, because they remember from 8 weeks ago, right? Ideally, they wouldn't remember, but they remember from 8 weeks before the class that they're going to get shocked. And what we know is that, so for instance, people with anxiety, they tend to tense up. Like if you tell them, I'm going to shock you, think about like, when you go to the doctors or the dentist and, you're going to get the shot or you're going to get a drill, you tend to tense up and, so then when it actually happens, like you tense up and you actually have like a smaller, in terms of your peripheral response, your sweat response, because you're already, sort of sweating before it even comes, then it's sort of a smaller change, because this is the change from baseline. So they're already tensed up, and so they have a smaller reaction and to being shocked, right? So even to they're having a smaller reaction to being shocked, right? Compared to the not being shocked. With the meditators, what we're seeing is that, like I said, there's no difference from pre to post. And so again, we realize that this is equanimity again. So even though they know they're going to get shocked again, right? They remember from 8 weeks ago, they're just sitting there and allowing themselves to be shocked and responding to it instead of defending against it. And this is really important because it's known, like I said, that people with anxiety, that they tend to have smaller responses compared to controls. That's not what I'm showing here, but this is typical, compared to a control. This is what you would see in an anxiety patient. And furthermore, what we found is that this differential was related to changes in stress. So the more people looked the same pre and post, the bigger change they had in stress, versus the bigger change they had from pre to post, the less stress reduction they had. And that's what's shown here. And then I'm not showing it. How are we doing on time? Oh, pretty good. Okay. Is that this is also related to a change in a major brain structure about how the amygdala, which is an emotion part of the brain, and the front of the brain are talking to each other. And so what we're showing in both of these studies is that mindfulness of the body is key for both pain and fear coping. And that shifting from thinking about and defending against threat to actually experiencing it openly and non-judgmentally is what's really happening, even in just 8 weeks, that this shift is happening, and that it's useful. It has real usefulness because it's related to the changes in stress. And so this brings up the good old quote from FDR. So the only thing we have to fear is fear itself, nameless, unreasoning, unjustified terror, which paralyzes needed efforts, right? And that's exactly what we saw in that second study, right? Is that they shut down. And, they weren't able to respond. This is a quote from a Will Smith movie, After Earth. Do not misunderstand me. Danger is very real, but fear is a choice. Just like pain and suffering, right? That, the danger out there is real, but how we respond to it is very, very much our choice. And then just one last quote, this is from Joseph Goldstein. Anything can happen anytime. We can going along just fine in our lives, and suddenly there's an accident, an illness, or some dramatic change in the conditions of the world. This was written before COVID, obviously, right? Some people may hear anything can happen anytime and think, oh, that's depressing. But rightly understood, it's not depressing at all. It's freeing, because in understanding this, we are not living in delusion. The mind actually relaxes, lets go of fear, and is much more open because we acknowledge the truth of change rather than deny it. Right? And which is just beautiful. And this is really, and so again, we saw that beautifully in that second study. I'm gonna stop sharing now. And, in the context of COVID, I mean, again, the danger of COVID is very, very, very real, obviously, but how we respond to it is very much a choice, so we can, hide out and be, very distrustful of everyone. Or we can say, okay, we're going to follow the precautions. And, we know that if we follow the precautions, it's extremely likely we're going to get at it. And so can we go out and enjoy ourselves while following the precautions, and, not be, glaring at everyone around us because, you think, oh my God, they're wearing a mask or something like that. So it really is a choice how we respond to what's going on around us. So that's it.
That was wonderful. Thank you so much, Dr. Lazar. I feel like you hit all the classic quotes on the matter. There's one, I'm sure you're familiar with it, but are you familiar with, I think it's Shinzen Young who sort of formulated it as a little equation. Have you heard this?
Yeah.
Pain, suffering equals pain times resistance. I think that's well put also.
Yeah, that's a good one too. I'll definitely have to add that one. Yes.
It's
Yes.
a good one, right?
Yeah. I mean, we can't show that mathematically, but yes.
No.
Yes.
I think the interesting point he was making is by making it multiplication, the implication is that if resistance is 0, then it's not really important what the level of pain is. The suffering will also be 0, right? Because you're multiplying by 0.
Oh, I see. Yes. Okay. Yes. Yeah. That's really
Yeah.
nice.
Well, all right. So that was perfectly timed. We're right at the hour mark, and so now it's time for Q&A. Stephen, go ahead.
Okay. I guess Sara, Lazar, thank you for presenting that. That was really interesting. My question for you is, if you had all of the resources, funds, and technology, even technology that's not invented yet, but that could be invented, and you were able to research a theory or a topic related to meditation, yoga, and the mind, that's of the most interest to you, what would you research?
Yeah, great question. Do you have money? Yeah, no. So I'm trying to raise money for this actually. So my big question is, I want to see the developmental trajectory of it. So I want to take newbies who've never practiced before and, put them through not just 8 weeks, but, really introduce them to meditation and then follow them for years and then try to follow what happens and can we actually see a developmental trajectory. And there's one tool that I really like that's related to, I thought about presenting it tonight, but I didn't. Maybe we can come back sometime in the future and talk about it. But it's a measure, it's called ego development. And it's sort of, for those of you who know about Piaget, so the idea is that, when a baby's born, babies aren't born running, right? They can't even, move practically when they're first born, right? Other than, they're moving their arms and hands. But then, there's crawling and then, sort of standing and then toddling and then walking and then finally running and then, dancing and then playing soccer, right? And you have to go through discrete stages. And this guy, Piaget, said that, well, that's actually true, not just of physical development, but of all types of development, right? And so he showed it with cognition, right? You don't start with, quantum physics, right? You start with 2 + 2, and then gradually it becomes more and more complex. And the idea is that our ego or our maturity levels is another way of thinking about it. All in our emotional maturity goes through stages as well, and that they're very well-defined stages. And there's a couple of questionnaires and whatnot and tests to help establish these different levels. And there's ideas that meditation helps transition people through these stages, and we have some brain data on this. That meditators tend to be score higher in these tests than non-meditators, and that we have brain correlates of it. And so I'd love to then take a bunch of newbies, give them this test, and then like maybe once a year, every couple of years, test their brains, test them on this test, and then show that, okay, yeah, this is what's actually happening with meditation, and this is what what it means to become enlightened, is that it's this emotional maturity and this sort of shift in personality and shift in how you see the world. So that's my dream project. So if you know anyone who's like a millionaire who wants to give a couple $1 million to do a big crazy study, I'm happy to talk to you.
That sounds really interesting. I talked to somebody at UC Boulder. They're doing like an ABC study on development of teens. It's longitudinal. I don't know if they're doing any kind of mindfulness intervention as a part of that, but maybe that's possible.
Oh, you never know. Yeah, that'd be great. This measure that I'm talking about was originally developed with teens, because it's really obvious in teens that they're going from this, because the idea is that at the lower levels, at the earlier levels, it's all me. It's all, I'm very me-centric, and, the world revolves around me. And then as you develop, you become less and less self-centered and more other-centered, and then non-centered, and we're all just interbeings. So yeah, that'd be cool.
Thank you.
Thanks, Stephen. And thank you, Sara.
All
right. So let's see. Mary has a question. Would you like to ask your question, Mary?
Okay, so I could talk to Sarah the whole hour and I'm not going to. Cognitive neuroscience in the 1970s. It's come a long way.
Yes.
I read the interview today that Mass General did with you, the one about women. Anyway, I can't remember what it was called because I'm 66. I'm just curious. I was reading in there that, first of all, I would really support the one in teens, and I'll start looking around because I'm an unemployed pharmacist. Okay, so I got plenty of time on my hands to try to find people with money. Secondly, I was fascinated with the Alzheimer's stuff because Alzheimer's runs in my family. My mother and both of my siblings died of Alzheimer's, and I took up meditation in 2014. I'd been chanting for 7 years before that and done other stuff before that. But cover of Scientific American magazine, November 2014, was probably mostly the 8-week MBSR stuff, and I took up meditation. So I just wondered if you could speak just briefly about, because I'm always looking for Alzheimer's.
Yes.
research. Okay.
Great question. So my very first study, we showed that long-term meditators had more gray matter than controls, but what was really interesting is the front of the brain, one or two very specific spots, it looked like there were some anti-aging effects. And since then, there's been several other studies showing that long-term meditators, that there seems to be some anti-aging effects on brains. And so now we actually are just finishing a study right now with with older people, 65 to 80, MBSR 8 weeks, and we're showing that, that even 65-year-olds, they can boost their brain and boost their memory, and that it persists for up to 2 years later. And then we did a small pilot study with people with mild cognitive impairment, which is the earliest stages of pre-Alzheimer's or pre-dementia. So it's usually as people are starting to notice they're having some memory problems, but they're still more or less functional. But they definitely have some real deficits, but they're not yet quite Alzheimer's or other types of dementia. And what we saw was that, so it was too small to do anything quantitative, but definitely people were benefiting. And then there was a study actually published like 2 years ago in the Canary Islands where they did a 2-year meditation intervention, and they showed, or 18-month intervention. And at the end of the 18 months, the people with the earliest stages of Alzheimer's, like the really, really early Alzheimer's and this mild cognitive impairment, they actually improved their memory. Right? It didn't have any impact on the people with like full-blown Alzheimer's, like in the later stages of Alzheimer's, but the early stages, it definitely seemed to boost their memory, which is really important because, as you guys know, because it gets progressively worse. And the holy grail of Alzheimer's, other than, completely curing it, is if you can just, so I shouldn't say the holy grail. The current goal of Alzheimer's research is just to delay the onset of the dementia. Because the idea is that, can you outlive it? So if you can just delay the start by 5 or 10 years, then you're much more likely to die of a stroke or a heart attack or something else. So, and so it seems like, that it can do that, it can, delay it and potentially even reverse it a bit so that then, you get to an older age before you have the full-blown Alzheimer's.
So the MBSR 8-week study has been published then?
No, we're actually just we're hoping to submit it next week. So.
Okay, great. Listen, thanks a lot. I really appreciate it.
Definitely. Keep practicing.
Thank you, Mary. And thank you, Sarah. All right. So let's see. Bijan, please go ahead.
Hi, Sarah. Thanks for doing this. I have a question. So you mentioned at the beginning sort of the difference between equanimity and just like becoming apathetic is the heart is open and kind of thing like that. And that sort of reminded me of sort of another way you can not feel pain is just by becoming numb to it. So actually, like physically, like literally put in the Novocaine into the place to shut off that pathway. And so I know, do you know of the difference between sort of in the brain of numbness versus I guess more equanimity, mindfulness?
Right. So you can actually, I don't know how the drugs work, the different drugs. Like I take that back. It's like morphine Morphine kind of sort of works like meditation because you feel the pain, but you just don't care. So actually, so it's not maybe not exactly meditation because meditation you do care, but so the morphine is turning off the front of the brain, right? And so I've only been on morphine once, and it was wild. It was a little bit like, yeah, okay, I feel it, and yeah, who cares, you know? Versus I think like Novocaine, those sorts of things that actually like so just if it turns off, I think it just so it's not even getting up into the brainstem. I think it just turns off the nerve at the source. And so then the signal's just not even transmitted into the spine and up to the brain, I think, but I don't know. And I'm guessing there's different ones work different ways.
And just slightly a follow-up to that one, how in practice do you think you would measure someone who's like successfully just numbing almost like, oh, I'm just going to learn how to ignore things rather than dealing or like accepting and being okay with it?
Well, right. Well, that's basically what we found in the
Oh.
long-term meditators versus the controls, the first study, because, you know, when they were being mindful, you know, they were probably just doing that. Because again, what you'll see is that the front of the brain will then turn off the back of the brain, right? So the distraction and attention, right? That's exactly how it works, is that you don't feel it. You just shut down that part of the brain. Yeah. It's amazing. Pain is really interesting, that we really have a lot of control over pain. And it's sort of, I mean, I don't know how much you guys have played with pain, but you know, you can amplify the pain, you can shut down the pain, all with your mind. And that's exactly what we're seeing, you know, with these studies, is that, you know, the controls are they're just shutting it down. Yeah.
Thank you very much.
Yeah.
Thanks. All right. Oh, I wanted to, before I forget, I got a text that I wanted to relay to you, Sarah. Mirabai Bush says hello.
Oh, hello. Excellent.
And she said she is really sorry that she can't be here today. She's doing a different Zoom about Ram Dass, but she says that you were extremely important in the early days of I think it was contemplative mind in society, right?
Yeah. Well, I don't know about that, but yeah, because she's been around a long time before. She started contemplative mind in society, so she's been around long before my research. But yeah.
Well, she wanted to pass that along. So
does she usually sit with you guys?
She comes now and then. She was a guest, a guest speaker, and then she would sometimes make a surprise appearance in the gallery. You know, cool. Which is always fun. We're big fans of Mirabai here. Yeah. All right. So seems like she's a big fan of yours. So okay, Matthew, go for it.
Hi. I'm also undecided because I have so much that I want to ask about. But so one question I have is about the difference between different kinds of meditation. So like in this group, you know, alone, there's a bunch of different meditation practices. There's Vipassana, there's Shamatha, and all this other stuff. So I was wondering if you have studied it all, or if you know about differences between the two and their effects on the brain.
Yeah. Well, go ahead.
Sorry. And then the kind of like follow-up is like, if you've looked at all specifically at people who kind of maybe talk about like the higher levels of attainment, or you know, like that kind of, because I think one of the constant questions in this group is like, are different paths actually do they lead to the same place? And so it'd be really interesting if you could, like, if we knew about that from a brain standpoint.
Right. So yes and no. There's been a couple of studies. We did one kind of sort of, there's been a couple others. So it's, the way I think about it is as exercise, right? And so it makes sense that, like, you know, if you go to the gym and you lift weights with your arm muscles are going to get, you know, versus if you do it with your legs, your leg muscles are going to get stronger. And so like, even, you know, within the same person, if they do mindfulness versus loving kindness meditation, you're going to get different brain regions. We did a study where we put people through either mindfulness-based stress reduction or the relaxation response, and both of them do a body scan. And so, but the body scan is very different, because in mindfulness, it's just notice your arms, notice your hands, notice your, you know, just notice. Versus in relaxation response, it's Notice and let them relax. Notice that your arms are heavy. Let your arms sink into the ground, right? And so there was a lot of overlap between those, but even that one instruction of just be aware versus aware and relax, we could distinguish those in the brain. And then there was another study, it was done in Asia. It was done with EEG. And they went to, I think it was like a Mahayana style and a Theravada style monastery, but they're in different countries. And they had both the people there do two types of meditation. So they had them do a concentration type of meditation and then an open awareness kind of meditation. And what they saw was that there were more similarities in brain activity within group than between group. So the open awareness and shamatha in the Mahayana look more similar to each other than the shamatha from the two different groups, right? So it does suggest that there is a difference in how it's being taught, but they're also different countries. So it could be cultural, it could be those particular people. There's a lot of problems with that study, but and again, how the shamatha is taught is not exactly the same. So probably all of that contributes, but I guess the other question though is at the end of the day, if it's just to get to that ultimate state of having that of understanding, right, of that moment of enlightenment, doesn't matter how you get there. I'm not sure. I mean, probably it does, but it's sort of one of my favorite quotes is from Swami Kripalu, and he said, "There's many paths up the mountain, but there's only one mountain." And my sense is that people are more dissimilar at the base of the mountain, but the closer you get to the top, the more it looks the same. So, but yeah, that's my guess. That's my guess.
Cool. Thank you.
Yeah.
Awesome. Thanks.
Mm-hmm.
And next up, Ben. Go ahead.
Hey, thanks for doing this, Sarah. Well, Matthew asked a very similar version to what my question was, so I'll pass on that and ask a slightly less interesting but important to me question, which is, I imagine you're somewhat familiar at least with the work of like John Sarno and the idea of like MBS is like muscle tension disorders that are maybe caused by underlying stress or the subconscious, things of this nature. I was wondering if you had any take or science behind the notion of whether or not that is more towards Jungian sort of psychology that is, maybe true for individuals, but not true for the masses or something, or actual like science. And if, meditation supports helping with those, but I think we all assume it does.
Right. I don't have a lot to say about that, actually. I mean, I think it's really clear that the mind body, this just here with the pain, it's really clear that, that's part of it, especially the second study with how they responded to the pain response 8 weeks later, that would be pretty clearly that, how their body is responding, to a painful stimulus has completely changed, and then under identical conditions, other than it's been 8 weeks and, they've gone through this program. So, yeah. And then also, I didn't show this, but the amygdala itself, which is the main fight or flight stress part of the brain, and that actually produces the stress chemicals, that actually changes with just 8 weeks of practice. And we've repeated that now 3 times. And what's interesting, or we've repeated it twice, we've done it 3 times total. What's interesting, so the first time we just did it in MBSR. The second time we did it with this study, with the versus exercise. Exercise doesn't do it. It's unique to meditation. And then even the third time we compared meditation to yoga to an education control. And even yoga didn't do it. Only meditation had this change in amygdala structure that was correlated with changes in stress. So again, it's really clear there's different ways to reduce stress and that they're not all the same. So I don't know if that answers your question or not, but
Well, thank you. As I said, I didn't think that was a super great question. I thought Matthew asked a much more interesting one. So anyway, thank you very much. Appreciate you doing this.
Uh-huh.
I liked it, Ben.
Did you like the answer?
I liked the whole gestalt. I enjoyed going on that entire journey with both of you. So we've got, let's see. Here's a question that was sent to me. No mention of whether they want to be anonymous or not, but I'll just read it and keep it anonymous anyway, to err on the side of caution. For an everyday user, do you recommend some meditation progress device like Muse? What should we track to measure progress in meditation?
Great question. You shouldn't. I shouldn't say that. So what are my thoughts? Yeah, I get a lot of questions about this. So there's a nuance to this. So let go of wanting to track progress. I cannot stress that strongly enough. Okay, the goal is to let go of everything, including wanting to make progress, right? That's the number one answer. I think, so there's two parts of that. So I think Muse, I haven't been asked this in a while. There's a lot of different ways to answer this question. My personal thought with it is that I think Muse could be useful when you're first getting started, because I think for a lot of people, again, it's the feeling life instead of thinking about life. Judd Brewer actually did experiment with this, putting people with real-time biofeedback in the MRI scanner. And they took some novices who had never meditated before, and they said, okay, pay attention to your breath. And then, if you do it right, it's going to go down. And this guy came out and he was just like, he got really, really, really frustrated because he was focusing on his breath, but instead of having less brain activity, he's having more brain activity. He couldn't figure it out. And then finally he had this, oh moment, because instead of thinking about the breath, he felt the breath. And the minute he stopped trying to pay attention to it and was just aware of it, brain activity turned off and it did what it was supposed to do. And so that was, and I think if he hadn't had that neurofeedback, he probably would have been thinking about the breath and focusing on the breath and sort of this very active awareness of the breath rather than just relaxed and feeling it for a long time. So I think something like Muse could be used in that way to sort of get people into that state, and so they understand that the target, what they're going for. But then I think at some point you want to let go of that and just, just be in that moment. And so also, so full disclosure, I'm a horrible meditator. I'm a really horrible meditator, right? My practice is all over the place. And I feel like, retreats are the way to go for me, right? Just because in retreats I can, my mind settles down. But what I've also noticed though, is that even when I just do short meditations, that for me, it's much more the moments, and it just like, because really all it takes is a moment, right? And so if you can sort of have, because I don't think it necessarily matters how much you focus, right? Because at the end of the day, what you really want is the insight, right? Because there is benefit to sitting and being very focused and very calm, right? There is definitely benefit for that, but the growth happens from the mindfulness. And so you really want to focus on the mindfulness, and those can happen, there's lots of ways to cultivate mindfulness that aren't involved in just sitting, right? You can really just focus on being mindful. And definitely sitting and focusing helps that, but there's other ways of doing that. So, so that's why I think it's that's how you're going to track your practice is, how mindful are you during the day, and how much are you noticing changes in your life, and you're noticing, little insights, even like little psychological insights. That's what's going to really change you. That's what's going to lead to the equanimity and ultimately to the enlightenment, is these little moments that, so I think that's my answer. I know that's not necessarily a popular answer, but that's my thoughts about it.
Thanks, Sarah. What you said, what I was thinking, and what I suspect a lot of people were thinking at the beginning about tracking progress. I'm sure there were a lot of people screaming inwardly, don't So
Yeah.
yeah.
Because the
And,
more you
and-
attach to it, the more it's not going to happen. You have to let go of absolutely everything.
And by the way, I suspect there were quite a few people similarly shouting in their heads when you said that you're a terrible meditator, thinking to themselves, well, of course, there's no such thing as that, right?
Right. Have
So-
you guys heard the Terrible Meditator poem? There's a poem. Oh, it's
No.
called I'm a Terrible Meditator. And it goes, and it basically goes through, it's like 30 or 40 lines of like, it just lists all the things he thinks about while he's sitting. It's like, oh, it's raining outside, and my ex-girlfriend, and oh, and sex, and this and that, and and he said, and then it ends with, I'm a terrible meditator. It's like, but he's completely aware of everything he was thinking about the whole way through. It's like, you don't have to be aware of your breath. You can just be aware of what's going on. That's it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
All right, we have a question from Brad. Brad, do you want to ask your question?
Sure. Hey, Sarah, thanks so much for joining us and sharing your knowledge. So I was curious about what your practice looks like, maybe some of the styles or techniques you use, and how it's evolved and been informed by your research. And also a follow-up question, I was curious if you have an opinion on nirvana / cessation and what that might look like in terms of like mental correlates.
Okay. So like I said, my practice is all over the place. I started off with yoga. And then one of my yoga teachers happened to include 5 minutes of Zen at the end of class. And I really liked that. And so that's what got me into the meditation. And so the first 6 months I did Zen, and I hated Zen. I hated sitting like this. And and also I think a little bit was that particular teacher. But then someone turned me on to Vipassana and to insight meditation. And I've been doing that ever since. I really struggle with breath awareness. And so for years, like I said, my mind was just like, but then I went on a retreat, and also because, I only sat once a week in class for years. I only sat once a week in class. Right. And then someone convinced me to go on a meditation retreat. Actually, Sharon Salzberg convinced me. I was like, but I can't sit. I'm a horrible meditator. She's like, it doesn't matter. Come and sit anyways. So I did. And I'm really glad I did, because that's when I first got my first sense of, oh, quiet. Okay, this is how it is, right? But I still struggled with it. But then Steve Armstrong, he's like, don't worry about the breath. Forget about the breath. Just be aware of the present moment, and awareness of itself, and, awareness of the mind, forget the breath. And that completely, utterly changed my practice. And I've been really practicing in that style much more ever since, where it's just, awareness of awareness. And the cool thing about that is because you really can do it throughout the day. Right. And it is much more likely to leading to these insights. Because a question I often get is like, well, how can I be mindful during the day? Like when I'm doing email. It's like, well, yeah, if your definition of being mindful is paying attention to your breath, there's no way you can pay attention to breath and do email at the same time. But if you're just aware of the present moment, emails, actually, I find emails a time when I actually tend to be very, very mindful, because I'm very aware of like, what's my tone of voice right now as I'm writing this email? And, noticing that, this person, I'm reacting to this person. And so that's really what, again, that's where the juice of it is noticing your activity, noticing what's actually going on you in real time as you're going through your life. So I highly recommend awareness of awareness. Carol Wilson's a great teacher, Andrea Fellow, they both teach that style. Steve Armstrong to a certain extent too. Mental noting is another way to get there. And then, so I'm a mom. And so for many years, I just went on 1 week retreat during the year, because that's all I could, so my quasi daily practice, I practice probably 3 or 4 times a week now, I'd say. But then once a year, I try to go on a retreat. And now that my son's out of the house, I actually just graduated from college last year, I'm doing many more retreats. So, because for me, the retreats are really where it's at. So. Awesome. Yeah. And then cessations in the brain. So there's something called the default mode network. You guys may have heard about this, the default mode of the brain. So it's really clear that gets turned off when you're meditating. And the idea is that probably it like even more gets turned off. My sense of it is, someone asked about sort of like the higher stages. So what's my sense is, and talking to a couple of neuroscientists who've actually gone through the jhanas, I've kind of gone through the 2nd level jhana. Every stage of jhana, for those of you who know what jhana is, is turning off more brain function. And so it really is cessation, because it's sort of, the way I think of it, it's sort of like stage lights. You know, there's a spotlight on the person, but you don't notice it until you turn off all the lights, you know, and then there's only the one spotlight left. And that's sort of what's happening when you go through the different levels of mindfulness, is that, you know, the chatter gets turned off, and then, you know, different, you know, the sense of time gets turned off, and the sense of space gets turned off, and then there's nothing left. So that's my sense of what's happening in those. And then when you do that, then the only thing left is awareness itself. So it's like, boom, there it is. So.
Very interesting. Thanks so much.
Yeah, yeah. So for those of you who are in psychedelics, psychedelics have just exploded the last couple of years in terms of brain science. And they're sort of jumping ahead of the meditation world because they can control it much more, you know, obviously, you know, with the drugs. And so there's been a lot of studies with, and, you know, people having cessation experiences with drugs in the scanner. And so if you really want, there's some really nice review articles. And if you want, you can contact me and I'll send you some of those.
That's interesting. I suspect that there are folks in the group who might be interested in that, to undersell that a bit. All right, Bijan, I think you had question number 2 queued up, so fire away.
Yeah, thanks. Thanks for indulging with more time. And so my second question actually is, so the first thing that I ever learned in a cognitive science class was the how you can study brain activity or neuroscience often with people who have gone through strokes, who have had problems in the brain with Phineas Gage. Phineas Gage, yeah, not Phineas Gage. The first, like, or like one of the main things of that. So I was wondering if there was any research on people who were experienced meditators, but who then had strokes or had sort of some kind of thing, and how maybe their brain plasticity was different from other people, or if they recovered from a stroke easier, or if there wasn't any difference or anything.
That's a good question. Yeah, I'm not aware of that study. Have anyone doing that? It'd be hard because, yeah, I'm not aware of anyone who's done that. It's an interesting question, though.
All right, Mary, please go ahead.
What was the area of the brain that you said changed during jhanas? I just didn't catch it.
Oh, yes. I forget the exact. So for those of you who know jhanas, there's 8 levels of jhana. Actually, 9.
Right.
Well, 4, but then 8, but then 9.
Yeah.
And so the different ones, there's different brain activity. So, okay. So it's only been done on one person, right?
1%. Okay.
Yeah. And it's Wilkinson. And so, and again, I don't remember the different. I remember the first and the second, because the first is the joy, and then the dropping away of joy, and that's turning off nucleus accumbens, right? That's really clear.
I'm sorry, that's turning off the what?
Nucleus accumbens, which is like the dopamine.
Could you just type that in the chat?
Nucleus accumbens. Yeah. Okay. So
thank you.
It's the part.
I can also do it, Sarah.
Okay.
I'm happy to. Okay.
There we go. It's a part of the brain that gets turned on by cocaine. So that gets turned off. Because I think actually it's the second to the third that happens. Because that's when you get more into to more equanimity, right? And so there's not so much the jazzing of the joy so much. And so it's much more sedate. And I forget what happens with the other one. So it's been a while since I've read that paper. But every stage is associated with a different pattern of brain activity.
Okay. And I just had a lived experience to share with the group, and I thought you might like to hear this, Sarah. So I took this up after I was in a car accident, and I saw that Scientific American study. I've been chanting for 7 years before. And one night, so I have pain, and we call it the second arrow in the tradition I'm in, right? Okay. And my son actually said it the other day. He's 28 years old, and he doesn't want to hear anything about Buddhism, and he was telling me about the second arrow, and I kept my mouth shut, right?
Yeah.
Going forward, I did have an experience one night where I was sitting with a group in my home before COVID, and my entire body just filled with beautiful energy, and all of the pain went away. And it's never happened again, and I haven't been striving for it, if you know what I mean.
Right, yep.
it's like, who knows, right?
Right. Yeah.
Who knows how this stuff works?
Right.
And I just wanted to share that.
Yeah. No, but like I said, I mean, so the second arrow, so we talked about the front of the brain, there's the I don't like it, make it stop. That's the second arrow, right?
Right.
And that really can turn off, in some cases turn off, can also turn it up and prolong it, right?
Oh yeah.
Yeah. But then, I mean, if you're like filled with joy and equanimity, then that's like a different way of turning off the pain. So.
Yeah, I mean, the tradition I practice is called the mind illuminated.
Yeah.
It's a popular one. But anyway, I just wanted to share that. Thank you.
Don't get stuck on what stage you're on. Same.
No, oh no. I'm way beyond that. It's a spiral.
I know. It's like, yes. Yeah.
Started saying it is a spiral. It is not linear. Okay.
Yeah. No. Yeah. I know. It's just, I often get questions like that, or I see questions about this sometimes about like, I'm on stage 6. How do I? And it's like, yeah. Okay. Yeah. So. Yeah.
Thank you, Mary. Thank you for sharing that with us. I'm also really glad to hear that you had that experience. That sounds really nice.
Yeah.
Also, I forgot to say this earlier, Sara, but Mazel Tov on your son's graduation.
Oh, thank you. Yes, it was a year ago, but yes. Yeah.
Well, I didn't know you yet.
Okay, there you go. So yeah.
All right. It looks like we've got Fred coming up next. Fred, you want to ask your question?
Yeah, I do have a question. Thank you. Studying meditation, great. That's awesome stuff. But it seems kind of a one-way thing, right? Do you have any examples of science that inform meditation and not the other way around?
Well, I would say that the design of the experiments is informed by the meditation, right? But sometimes, and actually someone asked me a question before about this, is like, how did my practice change? I'd say actually that my science has changed because of my practice. Like I said, sort of like when we first got some of the pain results, we were sort of like, wait, this doesn't make sense. This doesn't follow our hypothesis. But then we thought about the experience of it's like, oh, okay, that's, it was really, the science really informed the experience of the meditation, informed the interpretation of the results. But also, like, so for instance, I work with some people who they're studying meditation, but they don't actually practice, which I don't understand. And, the way they design experiments is just like, and then I try to explain to them, no, you need to do this, you need to do that. You're not going to see anything with that. And they don't get it. And so it's really clear that just the fact that, the people who are meditating, who are doing the research, are asking very different questions than the people who don't actually practice. So, yeah.
I see. Thank you.
Thanks, Fred. Thanks, Sara. Lauren, it seems like you might want me to just read the question, so I will.
Yeah, I'm happy to ask it. I just wasn't sure. My question to Sara is about yoga. And John, I wasn't sure if it was appropriate for this group, but I'm just
I think it's absolutely appropriate.
Okay, great. I'm a yogi myself, so I'm curious about your yoga practice and maybe at a high level some of the benefits that you have learned through your studies.
Yeah, no, I've done a little bit of studies with yoga. Like I said, I started with yoga. I needed to start with yoga. My mind was, I really needed the yoga. In fact, when I first started practicing meditation, I couldn't sit, and I always had to do a few minutes of yoga before I could sit down, just because otherwise my mind was just like, so that's personal experience. I started off with actually Ashtanga yoga. I can't do Ashtanga anymore though, but I really needed that fast, vigorous, energetic form of yoga when I first started. Now I do a very gentle, hatha yoga, like lie on the floor like your arm with this for 5 minutes, and then lie like this for 5 minutes, and it's much more meditative than my first yoga practice. So the little bit that we've done, we did one study where we did long-term meditators and long-term yoga practitioners. And I told you the first study, there was hints of anti-aging. And in particular, one of the regions that was most preserved in the long-term meditators is an area related to IQ, right? To have the ability to take novel information and use it to, or information to use it to solve novel problems. And so then the second, we repeated the study with the long-term meditators, long-term yogis, and this time through we gave them an IQ test. And what we found is that the yogis actually outperformed the meditators on the IQ test. By chance, the yogis had twice as many lifetime hours as the the meditation practitioners. And also we know that, yoga has an exercise component, and exercise is good for the brain. So maybe it had to do with the exercise, maybe it had to do with the extra hours. We didn't know, but they did score a little bit higher on the IQ test than the meditators. I told you before, my dream project with this test of ego development. So we also happened to give the same group of yogis and meditators that test. And what was interesting is that the meditators scored higher than the yogis on this test of emotional maturity and ego development. So even though the yogis had more experience, they scored lower. And so both of these tests, the study, it was a one-time shot, right? So we didn't get to see people over time. And at least in my experience, it seems like people are drawn to different types of practices based on all sorts of different things. So the people who do, this also gets to the question about the different types of yoga, of meditation. So my experience, the people who are drawn to really do mostly yoga are very different from people who mostly do meditation. And then even within the meditation world, it seems like, the people who do Vipassana, sort of Theravada style meditation are very, very different than the people I know who study more Tibetan style. And then Zen, is also kind of different. Like people I ever know who does Zen, it tends to be very sarcastic and have a really sharp sense of humor. That you just don't see that so much in Vipassana. And so it seems like, sort of like different types of exercise, that different types of people are drawn to different types of practices. And so we don't know if it's just that, okay, so people who score higher in this are more likely to meditate than they are to do yoga, or whether the meditation actually, is better at catalyzing this, whatever this is, than yoga. But that's, again, part of the study I would love to do, is to see how they all interact. And again, the yogis did score higher than the controls. So it was controls, yogis, meditators, but it was just sort of interesting that the meditators scored higher. Yeah. But their brains looked very similar. Like, in how they did that in the brain was the same between the yogis and the meditators compared to the controls. So the brains are the same, but for whatever reason, the meditators are just further along.
All right, thanks, Lauren. Thanks, Sarah. Someone said in the chat that's going to trigger some people because we've got that. It was meant completely jokingly, but because we have people from all sorts of traditions in the group. So that'll be interesting. We should do a personality test of all the people in the group and sort it by tradition and see what we learn.
Yeah. Again, at very small ends, but it just seems, not even much of personality. Again, the Zen didn't seem like a personality thing, but some of the other things, like the Tibetan versus Vipassana, at least for me, is sort of more, some of it's a little bit more devotional, because Tibetans are much more into like the deities and stuff like that. And so, I think people who are into deities are much more drawn to Tibetan compared to Vipassana, which is, because Vipassana is like, okay, like you don't even worship, kind of sort of worship the Buddha, but not so much. So.
Interesting. Yeah. Interesting thing for me to puzzle over as someone who started out in the Tibetan tradition and spent years in the Tibetan tradition, and I'm now concentrating mainly on the Theravada. Mm-hmm. What does that say about me and whatever weird journey I've been on?
Well, no, and there's all sorts of, like I said, I had to start with Ashtanga yoga. I had to start with that. There's no way I could have started with Vipassana. There's just no way, or even slow yoga. I need the fast yoga to start off with. So,
yeah. All right. So I don't want to monopolize. No one wants to hear from me. We've got more questions. Morgan, did you want to ask a question?
Hi. Yeah, I'm new to this group and I'm new to meditating. It's been a long time. So I really appreciate you spending your time and your knowledge. I have kind of an open-ended question. I was curious because you mentioned something about how people with anxiety responded a little bit differently to pain. And so I was curious if you had more to say about that, and if you've done more studies on people with mental health or emotional disorders in meditation.
Yeah, we've done a little bit. Specifically with anxiety. So there's a form of anxiety called general anxiety, which is people who are just, they're sort of worried about everything. And what's interesting is, if I show you a happy face and a negative face and a neutral face, you know, most people, you know, they respond a certain way to happy faces and a certain way to negative faces, and then the neutral face, you don't have much reaction. So people with general anxiety, they respond to neutral faces very similar to negative faces. And the idea is that because they're like, oh my God, what is this person thinking about me? You know, and you know, it's ambiguity, and they don't like ambiguity, and so their amygdala fires big time when they see a neutral face. And so we put people with general anxiety in the MRI scanner, and we showed them positive, negative, and neutral faces, and then put them through MBSR. And then what we saw was that their amygdala normalized, and so they to the neutral faces, and so there was no change to the positive or the negative faces, which again, our hypothesis was they're changed to the negative faces, but they actually changed to the neutral faces. And the change in response to the neutral faces correlated with changes in anxiety. So they had less anxiety, and they were less reactive to these neutral, you know, faces that were ambiguous and unknown. So that was one study we did. And then I'm trying to think what else we've done. We did a little bit with depression, and we showed that self-compassion is incredibly important in the context of depression. So one of the symptoms of depression is rumination. So just this repetitive negative thinking. And people with higher self-compassion tend to have less rumination. And the people who have bigger changes in self-compassion over the course of the 8 weeks of training had bigger decreases in rumination, and you know, bigger decreases in depression, and those were interrelated. So it really seems that a big component of what's happening in the MBSR and MBCT is self-compassion. And there's been more and more research with self-compassion, and it really is, in the context of mental health, it seems like it's extremely potent. So I highly recommend it. And there's a lot there's a lot of, if you go to Chris Germer or Christy Neff's website, you know, they're the ones who really developed this. They had developed an 8-week program that's just like MBSR, but was for self-compassion. They have a lot of guided meditations with self-compassion. So highly recommend that. Yeah.
Thanks, Morgan. And thank you, Sarah. And so that was our last question, I think. So we can wrap up if that's okay, Sarah.
Yeah.
All right, great. Well, this was pretty awesome. Thank you so much for coming and doing this with us. Any final things that you want to say before we close and say goodbye?
No, just thank you. You had great questions.
Thank you for joining us. This was really super interesting and enlightening and enjoyable. So thank you for joining us. Please come back.
I will. Yeah.
All right. Thanks, everybody. Take care. See you soon. Bye.